All right, what we're going to do now is we're going to do another session on poetry because there's just a lot to this kind of a study. So we wanted to look at another psalm where we're going to take you through and we're going to have you outline it and then chart it. And it's going to be a little bit more work than the last time, but we're going to see the parallelisms that are being used. And so this is very important. If you'll notice the information in your manual on assignment number 4, Hebrew poetry. All right, assignment number 4. And notice it says on the information, using parallelism of Hebrew poetry to gain insight into the meaning of the text. So what you're going to find is the parallels give you a lot of insight. So we're going to learn to identify them. Poetry is filled with figurative language. Therefore, we must learn to understand the meaning of non-literal or picture language. The distinguishing mark of Hebrew poetry is a correspondence in thought, a parallelism between one line and the following line, or between one section and the following section. Hebrew poetry uses lots of repetition, and this is a great help in understanding what the meaning of the text is there. So we've got down for you 3 basic kinds of parallel thought in Hebrew poetry. We have synonymous parallelism. That's where one idea is expressed in a second or third time in a similar way. Ada and Zella, hear my voice. Wives of Lechem, listen to my speech. So it's just a repetition of the same idea. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity, or cleanse me from my sin. Again, the same form of repetition there. And then you have synthetic parallelism, where the poet is going to add to the original concept. And we saw that in Psalm 1. Each phrase in the verse adds an additional thought. To walk with the wicked must be the first stage. To stand with sinners is even worse. And to sit with the scoffers would seem to be the ultimate. And then thirdly, you have antithetic parallelism, where the poet will contrast one idea with another. And the example, of course, is Psalm 15:2. The tongue of the wise makes knowledge acceptable, but the mouth of fools spouts folly, in Proverbs 15:2. So you'll see that how the second phrase generally gives a negative of the thesis of the first phrase. So again, you'll see how it works. And so what we're going to do is we're going to read Psalm 139. So that's the first thing I want you to do. Read the text, and then I want you to go through and outline it, all right? And so we're going to go through and outline Psalm 139, and you'll find a couple pages over, you'll see an outline to fill in. And what I want you to notice in the outline there, you've got an outline and then a charting page, so just turn over there where that outline is there. And what you're going to do is fill in the outline, and you'll see I've got 6 things that I want you to, ideas that I want you to pick up as you go through Psalm 139. And I want you to then tell me the verse numbers, all right? And then I want you to identify the type of parallelism that's there. Okay, now this is not easy, but it's something that you want to learn to pick up as you go through it. See if they're adding to the original idea, or he's just saying the same thing in a similar way, or if he's contrasting. What you'll find is these 3 are mixed in frequently in your poetry text. So you want to learn to pick them up out of the text there. So I'm going to ask you to do that in your outline. Outline it first, and then go back and say, okay, what is this? What kind of parallel is it? All right? So go ahead and I want you to outline first, and then we're going to get into the charting. So we'll stop right here, okay? So stop the DVD, and would you just go through and break the text apart, and then we'll review it in a few moments, all right? All right, I want to review this outline with you now. And so we first find starting in verses 1 all the way down through verse 6, where he's talking about God's omnipresence. Now that's a big word, but the idea is it's God's complete knowledge of everything. There's nothing God does not know. He has all knowledge. Lord, you have searched me and known me. There is nothing that God does not know about you. He knows you're sitting down and you're rising up. And so verses all the way down through verse 6, he's talking about God's omniscience, the fact that God has complete knowledge of him. And then starting in verse 7, all the way down through verse 12, 7 through 12, he's talking about God's omnipresence, all right? And it's just the idea of God's presence. There's no place you can go where God can hide. You can hide from God. He's everywhere. And where can I go from your spirit, or where can I flee from your presence? He's everywhere. You can't escape him in any way. And so he talks about that. And then starting in verse 13, he talks about God's creation, how God has created him, 13 all the way down through, I believe it's verse 16, 13 through 16. He's going to talk about God's creation. And then he talks about God's thoughts. All right, 17 all the way down to verse 18, 17 and 18. And then he talks about, that you would slay the wicked, O God. So verse 19 all the way down through verse 22, he's talking about the hatred of sin. All right. And then the last thing he's going to talk about in 23 and 24 is God's search. Search me, O God, and know my heart. So there we have the breakdown of the text of Psalm 139. All right, and then what we see here as we go through this, we see the type of parallelisms, and we will go over that as we go through the psalm. So we'll pick up the type of parallelism there. So, okay, so we'll do that in our next session. So what we want you to do now is we want you to take every verse and go through it and break it apart, just like you've been doing in the other assignments. Make your observations, your interpretations, and your applications, and then we'll review that in just a few minutes. All right? So go to work. All right, I'd like to go over the charting with you now. They've taken some time and broken the text apart. And I just have a little bit here, but you get an idea of, again, how you break the verses apart. So I wrote down actually the whole verse here in verse 1. O Lord, you have searched me and known me. And so I'm just taking that observation, and then I made an interpretation. I said, God knows everything about me. He has searched, his search is very thorough. There is absolutely no detail about me that God doesn't know. And so my application, God knows every detail about my life. And again, the applications can vary there, but that's just a simple application that I made. And then the next thing he talks about, he says, you know my sitting down and my rising up. You know, God knows when you're sitting down. You're sitting down right now, right? He knows that. See, that nothing can hide from God. You know, his presence or his knowledge is so complete. Everything you do, you know, it's interesting. Sometimes, we do something wrong or we say something. I'm sure you've never done that. You know, you got mad or something. Some words came out of your mouth, and the first thing you did, you look this way and you look this way to see if anybody's around that might have heard you. And you realize you're looking the wrong way. You should have looked up. Oh, Lord, I'm sorry I said that. But he knows everything. He knows you're sitting down, you're rising up. He says, you understand my thoughts afar off. Boy, God knows every thought you have. Isn't that amazing? He knows every word you're going to talk about, even before, as he talks about, for there's not a word on my tongue. Oh, but behold, O Lord, you know it altogether. You comprehend my path, my lying down. You're acquainted with all my ways. You've hedged me behind and before. You've laid your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It's high. I cannot attain it. You understand the psalmist here is not a very dumb guy. He's pretty bright. And he said, I can't get it. And boy, if he can't get it, I certainly am not going to get it either. But this knowledge that God has, it's so complete. Every little detail of your life, God is totally familiar with. Isn't that something? How God knows us. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It's too high. I can't attain it. I don't know how you do that, Lord, but you do it. And I'm so thankful that you do. And so that's the first thing that he talks about is God's omniscience, that there's this incredible complete knowledge that God has of everything. And then I want you to notice in this particular section here, all right, this is where you see how he's adding to the idea here. So this would be what we call synthetic. Synthetic parallelism, where he's going to add to the original idea. Lord, you have searched me, you've known me, you know my sitting down. So he's just adding to the idea there of God's search and how God knows us, his complete knowledge of you. All right, and then he says, where can I go from your spirit? Verses 7 through 12 now, the second idea. And so God's omnipresence, God's presence is everywhere. Where can you go that God is not? If I flee from your presence, there's just no place that you can hide from God. If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in hell, behold, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning, the height, and then dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, the depth. There's no height, no depth where God cannot be. He says, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me. If I say, surely darkness shall fall over me, even the night shall be light about me. Indeed, darkness shall not hide from you, but the night shines as the day. Darkness and light are both alike to you. So do you see what the writer is doing there? He's using another type of parallelism. You see the contrast? He's going, where can I go from your presence? If I go to heaven or down to hell? You see the contrasting going on there? Where there's darkness, there is light. And so he's using what we call antithetic parallelism here, all right? Okay, so there's another form of a parallelism that's going on where he is contrasting back and forth. And then we see in verses 13 through 16, he talks about, for you have formed my inward parts. You've covered me in my mother's womb. I will praise you, for I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are your works, that my soul knows it very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I made in secret and skillfully wrought in the lowest parts of the earth. Your eyes saw my substance being yet unformed, and in your book there were written all the days fashioned for me, when yet there was none of them. And so now we see the marvelous creation of God and how God created us. And what he's doing here, he's using now synonymous parallelism, all right? All right, synonymous parallelism, where he's talking about how God created us, and we just think about the creation of God, and how beautiful His creation. He formed me in my inward parts. You covered me in my mother's womb. How God put us together so intricately, and I will praise you. And I'm fearful of how I'm wonderfully made. Marvelous are your works. My soul knows it well. And you just think about how God created us, the womb, Isn't it amazing what's happening in our world today? All the abortions. Because it's really not a human being. It's my choice, whether I want this baby to be born or not. No, it's not. You had nothing to do with it. It's God that has created you. And when we say, our Supreme Court's not quite sure when human life begins, and so we have these, that really hasn't begun yet, But no, God formed you in the womb. That's when He created you. And so we see this mass murder going on around the world today. It's so, so sad because we're killing created beings. And yet, it's okay because I have a right. I have a choice. And my goodness, how people are going to have to answer for how they have dealt with human life. We have killed millions and millions of human beings just in our own country alone, and of course around the world. All right, so that's synonymous parallelism. Now what he's doing, he's saying the same thing in a similar way, how God made us. All right, and then he talks in 17 and 18. He says, how precious are your thoughts to me, O God. How great is the sum of them. If I should count them, they would be more than the numbers of the sand. When I awake, I'm still with you. So now he's giving us God's thoughts, and this is synthetic parallelism because he's adding to the original idea again. So you got synthetic. All right, so there's an addition to the thoughts of God. How in the world can you count the thoughts of God? They're precious in His sight, and the sum of them. I just think of all the thoughts of God, all He thinks about, all the details about you and me. How can God do that? There's so many things that He would have to think about. I think about my day, and I'm pretty limited in what I can remember about what I need to do in the day. Of course, I have to write things down. But God knows all those thoughts. And I jumped over it here, but this verse 16 is so interesting. He says, "Your eyes saw my substance being yet unformed, and in your book there were written all the days fashioned for me, when yet there was none of them." And so he talks about a book where something is written in it. Well, we do that, right? We have to write down things to remember. And remember, in the Old Testament, there's what was called a book of remembrance. And the kings would have these books, and they would write in different things that they didn't want to forget. Well, does God forget? No. Does God need a book? No. But He's using an example to help us understand that these things are recorded. And God has a recording of everything that's happened in our lives. And He even knows from the day before you were born, He knows when you're born and when you're going to cease to be on this earth. But He knows all those details. But think about those thoughts that God has. Incredible thoughts that He has about you and about me. He thinks. And those thoughts are, He says, if I could count them, they'd be more than the numbers of the sand. You ever tried to count sand? You pick up a handful of sand to try to count those little grains. I mean, it's impossible. But there's so many of them. And that's the thoughts that God has. He has thoughts, all those details about you and I. And so He gives us an idea of the thoughts that He has. Then in 19 to 21, he talks about what seems to not fit in this psalm, because the whole thing is just flowing with beauty of God's thoughts. And then suddenly he says, "Oh, that you would slay the wicked, O God. Depart, therefore, you bloodthirsty men, for they speak of you wickedly. Your enemies take your name in vain. Do I not hate them, O Lord, who hate you? Do I not loathe those who rise up against you? I hate them with a perfect hatred. I count them as mine enemies." And boy, it's kind of like you got this little section here about his hatred for sin that he's bringing up. And it's kind of like it doesn't really fit there. But it does. Because, you see, God hates sin. God does not hate people, but he hates the sin of the people. And he wants you and I to also to live in such a way that we would hate sin. But you know the problem? We are so exposed to sin today that we don't hate it. You know, we just have it around us. There's so many things around us today, and you know, it's just kind of like we let it go. But God doesn't want us to let it go. He wants us to hate it. He wants us to stand against sin. He doesn't want us to allow it to happen. What's happening with the homosexual movement today, that is sin. It's not to be accepted. But how many churches have accepted it into their congregation? It's a sin. God loves those sinners. He loves those people, and he wants them to repent. But the movement wants us to accept them, you know, in our churches, in our leadership, everywhere. And folks, you can't do it because it's sin. We love the people, but we hate the sin. And that's our God. And that's what he wants us to understand. And so, again, he's using what we call synthetic parallelism here in this section here. All right? So we have another section where he's adding to the idea about God's hatred towards sin. And he says, "Don't I also hate them, O Lord?" And so again, you and I are to not accept sin. We're to hate it, stand against it. And then he ends in verses 23 and 24. He says, "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my anxieties, and see if there's any wicked way in me, and lead me in a way everlasting." And so he asks for God to search his heart. And again, we see this as a synthetic type of parallelism that he's using here, where he's adding to the idea to get the point that God searches me. He begins by saying, "Lord, you have searched me and known me." Now he ends that psalm by saying, "Lord, search me, search my heart." And that's such an important prayer to pray every day. "Lord, search my heart. You know, show me if there's any wicked way in me." You know, it's so easy for evil just to creep right into our lives, and we're not even aware sometimes that it's there. And so we need to have God search. And he says, "Try me, Lord, know my anxieties." You know, we're not to be anxious, right? Scripture talks about not being anxious, but we are from time to time. And he says, "Lord, search my heart, know me, and see if there's anything wicked in me, and lead me in an everlasting way." And so what the psalmist takes us through is just this beautiful, beautiful poetry that helps us to understand how much God really loves us and cares for us. That there's nothing you can hide from God. Absolutely nothing. And he wants you to know that everything about you, he's intimately acquainted with all of your ways. And so we have a wonderful God. Amen? Now, I've gone through this really quickly, but again, I wanted you to see the different types of parallels. Look at the parallelisms here. We've got three types at work. Synthetic, he's adding to the original idea. Then he contrasts. And then we have synonymous, where he just says the same thing in a little different way. and then he's using synthetic parallelism and these different ideas. And so what you're going to find as you work through a text and you get the different ideas, I try to identify the parallels there. And as you do that, it helps you to really understand really what he's trying to do. And so this is the way Hebrew poetry works. It's a very beautiful kind of writing. They use parallels to get their point across. And once you pick up the parallel, then you're going to get the idea of really what he's saying. So every time you work with poetry, look for the parallelisms because they will find them. When you get into like Proverbs, for example, just every proverb, it's a parallel. And they're contrasting, just constant contrasting going back and forth here. So a lot of individual ideas when you get into like Proverbs. It's not just, you're not going to connect a whole lot of ideas, but every verse is giving you some kind of a contrasting going on back and forth. So the overall theme for Psalm 139, remember every time we study, get that overall theme. And what I've come up as I've looked at the text and worked through it is I realize that I'm secure in the Lord. He knows me. And so I've entitled it Security in the Lord. And it's good to know that my life is in God's hands. Do you agree? God has us in his hands. The overall type of parallelism, you can see the main type overall in this psalm is more synthetic type of a parallelism, although he uses a couple other types there. But again, I'm secure in him. So that's the theme of Psalm 139. There we have it. That's the lesson on Hebrew poetry, working with the parallels that are in the text.